Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel, Analyze This Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. Today, we are revisiting Spectre. Spectre is one of 4 films celebrating its anniversary this year. It's 10 years old, if you can believe that, and I don't think this will be the last video I make on Spectre this year. Some Bond fans have commented on past videos of mine that Spectre is one of their least favorite Bond films. That's not even worth discussing, but it's a film that I think about a lot. I actually think about Spectre more than I think about most Bond movies, and that's because it's a film with elements I really like. In many ways, it is the Daniel Craig movie that is the closest to the rich, operatic style of Bond movie that I really want to see. But the pieces don't fit together in any satisfying way. And that makes Spectre something of a puzzle for me. I can't stop thinking about the ways in which small changes might have made a big impact on how that movie plays, how that movie works. Previous versions of this video that I've tried to record and have since scrapped essentially had me going through the movie scene by scene and almost describing what I would change to fix that film as a kind of script doctor. That structure might have worked as a sort of audio commentary on the film, but it didn't really work as a video. So I'm going to approach it from a different angle here. And we're going to talk about this film in essentially 3 buckets. And these 3 buckets are fundamental elements of every Bond movie. And that is Bond himself, the villain, and then Bond's love interest. All 3 of these pieces kind of need to sit in some level of harmony in order for a Bond film to work. They're all essential pieces of the narrative. And in the case of Spectre, all 3 are seriously overburdened. There's a famous maxim about fashion that I believe is attributed to Coco Chanel, which is that before you leave the house, take one thing off. Spectre, before it debuted on screens, could have afforded to drop more than one subplot. It's an overcrowded movie. And so let's just talk through each of these 3 elements and the ways in which they could have been slightly adjusted, keeping the basic structure and outlay of the final film, its set pieces, its cast, everything like that in place, but still have been substantially improved. So let's start with Bond himself. This film had the tall order of giving Daniel Craig a possible exit from the series. He really envisioned Spectre as being his last Bond film. And that creates some complications for Bond's arc here, because you know that you need to have an endpoint for the character when Spectre wraps up. And that endpoint was decided to be pretty early on, that Bond would retire from the service with a new love who would become Madeline Swan. That creates some complications in how you flesh out the story because of where Skyfall leaves off. Skyfall leaves Bond in a somewhat precarious place. Bond is recommitted to his role as an agent of the Secret Service. He has been, quote-unquote, resurrected through the events of Skyfall. He has confronted the trauma of his childhood. He has bid farewell to his surrogate mother figure in M, and realigns himself with his duty as an agent of the British Secret Service at the end of Skyfall. But there's still some lingering ambiguity there. In Skyfall, MI6 is made very vulnerable. There is a terrorist attack on British soil. M is targeted during a recorded video hearing. This is obviously a major event that would shake Britain to its core, and it would further destabilize the British intelligence community. So it makes sense that there would be aftershocks from that on a narrative level, and that there would also be aftershocks for Bond, who, while he was able to live up to the mission M gave him in dispatching Silva, he wasn't able to save M. M's sins of the past caught up with her, and she was lost to him. And so there's some unfinished business there. So it makes sense that Spectre really needs to pick up from where that left off. So you have a clear starting point where Bond is attempting to grapple with the aftermath of Skyfall, and then he needs to end up in a place where he can walk off into the sunset with Madeline Swan. I would argue that if you were to build this film in a vacuum, that is probably too much to lay at the foot of one movie. But I think there are ways in which the finished film could easily have made that work. If you recall the finished film Spectre, it opens with Bond in Mexico City hunting down Spectre agents. He's been put on the trail by Judi Dench's M, who's kind of sent him a message from beyond the grave, kicking him into this investigatory quest. Now, nobody in MI6 knows what Bond is doing. He's just kind of operating on his own independent directive. Skyfall really destabilized MI6 and left it vulnerable. And that's why there's this new, somewhat corporatized approach to intelligence that's infiltrating the British intelligence sector, the Nine Eyes Initiative led by C, this idea that MI6 is now so outdated that it needs to be replaced. That idea functionally works, and it makes sense that you would position Bond as well as his MI6 allies as the front against this insidious threat that is coming to kind of wipe out the old guard of MI6, because MI6 was left so vulnerable after the events of Skyfall. So if you kind of realign what Bond is doing and how he's working at the start of Spectre and all those subsequent conversations with Moneypenny, M, Q, C, Tanner around this clear idea that Bond wasn't given a secret mission by M. Instead, really pick up from where Skyfall left off. At the final moment of Skyfall, Bond is given a new mission folder by the new M, played by Ralph Fiennes. Perhaps at the beginning of Spectre, Bond is still following what Ralph Fiennes' M gave him the task to do. Perhaps what Bond has really been doing is he's investigating the aftermath of what happened in Skyfall. When M died, there was obviously going to be a lot of subsequent investigation into Silva and all the different tendrils that fed into his organization. So all you need to do is explain that after M's funeral, MI6 had clearly identified that somebody had been funneling funds into Silva's operations, had been giving him resources. Somebody clearly wanted MI6 destabilized. And that same pipeline of money seems to have been feeding into other contacts related to this Nine Eyes operation. So you can have this unified front where Bond, Ralph Fiennes' M, Moneypenny, and Q are all aligned together against this new threat of C and this Nine Eyes initiative, which from the outset they just automatically don't trust. And all of them are aligned together to preserve the legacy of Judi Dench's M in the wake of the tragedy of Skyfall. That cleans up a lot of things. There's a lot less exposition and entanglement with the character relationships that don't add up to a lot of things. You know, in the finished film, Bond's antagonistic relationship with Ralph Fiennes' M doesn't really go anywhere. All this sort of back and forth with Q and Moneypenny about are they his allies, are they not, doesn't really pay off in the film. It's a lot cleaner to just have everybody on the same page working in secret to find out what's going on with C and the Nine Eyes initiative. And this further clarifies the narrative where the attack in Skyfall is really the first of Spectre's many terrorist attacks to lay ground for this Nine Eyes initiative. They're destabilizing the global intelligence community, and Skyfall was the first attack in that line. And what they were just doing was using Silva as essentially their blunt weapon to make sure that all of that would kick off. And that gives Bond and the MI6 crew a very clear motivation. They are restoring MI6 in order to honor Judi Dench's M. It's about living up to the legacy of Judi Dench's M. There's a line in Skyfall from Judi Dench's M that she doesn't want to leave MI6 in a worse place than when she found it. And in many ways, this is her team fulfilling that wish for her. They're going to make sure that MI6 continues to exist. And that gives Bond a fundamental narrative goal from the outset that's very clear, that can also give him an exit point at the end of the movie. He has satisfactorily fulfilled the promise that he made to M in Skyfall by preserving MI6, by taking down the threat of Spectre, that also allows him to walk away at the end. Because if MI6 is intact, he's not the only one who needs to save the world. There is an intact British intelligence agency that will continue to exist without him, and he can step away in some measure of comfort, knowing that he's fulfilled his obligation to Judi Dench's M, and knowing that there will be more double O's to follow after him that can continue to keep saving the world. That, I think, cleans up a lot of the mess with Bond's initial motivation in Spectre, where we start to see that he's trying to trace things out of obligation to Judi Dench's M, and then this weird stuff with, Blofeld and his Bond's childhood starts to come into it. It gets very messy very quickly, and if we really use that as the focal point, make sure that C is a clear villain from the outset, and the MI6 gang is really just working to find out who is the shadowy force behind that, I think that clears up a lot of stuff, at least in the first act of Spectre. Now let's talk about the villain, Blofeld. Spectre had a really challenging task, which was, in addition to giving Daniel Craig an exit from the series, it was to reintroduce Blofeld to audiences. And Blofeld has not been a part of the Daniel Craig era up to this point. In fact, Spectre coming in at this stage is a bit odd because we already had a similar organization to Spectre introduced earlier in the films, Quantum. I think instead of introducing this angle that they went with, that Blofeld has some connection to Bond's childhood, which doesn't really work thematically with what else the movie is doing, they really needed to take a step back and just say, this movie's primary conflict is about the old guard of MI6 versus this corporatized vision of intelligence. And I think that makes sense. If you look back at Thunderball, the way Blofeld functions in that movie, the way that Spectre meeting functions, it's essentially just a sinister corporation. Blofeld is essentially the world's most evil CEO, manipulating global events for his own profit. I think you really lean into that idea of Blofeld being this sinister CEO slash shadowy dictator type. And the finished film touches on that. When Blofeld introduces himself at the Spectre meeting, or when he shows up in his lair in the crater at the end, the most menacing moments for Christoph Waltz's Blofeld are these moments that show that he has such a almost spiritual hold over his organization. Everyone is terrified of him because they know they are effectively meaningless to him, that everybody is expendable. And the sense that Blofeld sees everybody as expendable in the entire orbit around him is pretty chilling, and is probably a great way to just kind of lean into Blofeld as this sort of inhuman sociopath. This guy who really just sees people as pawns that he can exert his influence over. You don't have to change the structure of the story too much to go with that angle. It's just essentially, you rewrite the Spectre scene, and you rewrite the Mr. White scene, and then you rewrite the stuff that happens in the crater climax and his dialogue with Bond. But a lot of it can just follow narratively the same structure. Maybe you just change some tweaks that, Quantum was demolished after the film Quantum of Solace. Judi Dench's M and Bond went through and swept through and, demolished Quantum. And that left that organization pretty vulnerable. And from the ashes of Quantum, Blofeld and Spectre emerged in a sort of sinister, hostile takeover. And that left Mr. White on the outside because of this shift in balance of power. And now Christoph Waltz's Blofeld is trying to fulfill his vision of a world that he controls, because if he can control all the intelligence streams of the world, he can manipulate the course of nations. That's why there are so many terrorist attacks happening across the globe, laying this foundation for a destabilization of the global intelligence community. I think that works fine, and you just really lean into Christoph Waltz's Blofeld being this sort of chilly, ruthless sadist, a guy who is willing to show Meline the video of his father killing himself just to really make her suffer and just kind of see what would happen, just out of sheer malice. And I think that cleans a lot of things up. That gets us away from Blofeld being the author of Bond's pain. He's really just annoyed with Bond because Bond is the person who's going to stand up to him. And Blofeld is not used to having someone stand up to him. He's used to having everyone buckle before his influence. And the conflict between the two of them is really just a power struggle, which again goes back to the dynamic that was established between those characters in the 1960s. You don't need this complex dynamic between them if you have that. And it further clarifies this dynamic that the tension is really between the old guard intelligence community and this new sort of corporatized, digitized world that has bad actors driving it. Blofeld is the evil CEO, and C is his, vice president, his executive lackey. If you use that dynamic, I think it clarifies the themes a bit more. Now let's talk about Meline. Meline is tricky because I think No Time to Die fixes a lot of the issues with the Bond-Meline romance in Spectre. That romance has so much laid at its feet, and it's essentially a successor to Bond's two great love stories. It's doing a version of Bond falling in love with Tracy from the film On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and it's also trying to call back to Bond's relationship with Vesper in Casino Royale. Trying to catch lightning in a bottle a third time that way is almost an act of hubris. But assuming the pieces in the film are what we have in place, she's Mr. White's daughter, and she has to accompany Bond on this journey, I think you just really need to clarify her character a little bit, and her relationship to Bond. One of the things that works with Bond's relationship to Tracy and Bond's relationship to Vesper is there is a bit of give and take in terms of power exchanges throughout the story. They start a little frosty, they warm up to each other, one person saves the other. It's notable that both Tracy and Vesper help save Bond's life at different points in the story. That sort of back and forth in the Meline-Bond relationship isn't really done appropriately. One starting point, for example, is Bond and Meline meet in the frostiest introduction they could have possibly done, and there's no real sense of attraction between the two of them. That feels like a really big misstep. Obviously, Bond's relationships to Tracy and Vesper started on semi-hostile terms, but there's a sense of attraction between them in both of those movies that carries you through that sort of prickly back and forth. The way to pitch Bond's introduction to Meline might have been more along the lines of Bond meeting Kara for the first time in The Living Daylights, this sort of tender moment where Bond is confessing about Mr. White's death in a way that is not trying to be harsh or ruthless or provocative, but is almost tender. Bond should have a sensitive side, and he should be compassionate about a young innocent who is caught up in this dark world. And I think if you start to frame his attitude towards Madeline in that light, you can start to build a stronger relationship between the two of them. And if she starts to see Bond from the outset as more of a protector figure, it can explain why she starts to gravitate towards Bond as well. Because her fundamental arc is a character who is stuck in a life of trauma. She was born into this dark world that Bond and Mr. White inhabit, where murder is commonplace. And what she longs for most is an exit from that world. And if you build their relationship around that, it makes a lot more sense that she would potentially ask Bond to leave that world with her, to ask Bond to envision an escape from the world, because those who live by the sword will die by the sword, as the good book says. And there's a sense in which, unless Bond just finally chooses to put the sword down, he's going to die one day. That's something Fleming's Bond knows very well. Bond has just kind of come to terms with that. He's going to die in his, late 30s or early 40s. Like, one day a bullet's just going to catch up with Bond and he is just going to end. And he's living ferociously because he's assuming death is right around the corner. And you can have Madeline, this vulnerable character, suddenly be an opportunity for Bond to do what he wasn't able to do with Vesper, which is to protect this innocent from this dark world and escape with her from it so that they can both have a happy ending. So at that final scene on the bridge, which I don't think makes any sense in the movie, where Bond is confronting Blofeld for the final time and Bond throws his gun away, the movie plays that final scene as a moment between Bond and Blofeld. It tries to stage that as a personal connection between Bond and Blofeld. I think that was a tactical mistake. I think that moment really needed to be about Bond and Madeline. It really needed to be about Bond answering Madeline's ask that they could leave this life together. And the reason Bond puts his gun down, essentially, is that he knows that MI6 is intact, that MI6 can continue to carry on without him, and that he has a pathway to a brighter future with Madeline. And you really needed to stage that moment as a moment where Bond is connecting with Madeline and then choosing to put his gun away, rather than Bond just looking at Blofeld and being like, I'm going to just toss the gun aside. It needed to be much more dramatically clear. Similarly, I think the moment where Bond is most vulnerable in the movie, in the torture scene, and I think the torture scene has other issues that could have been clarified with writing, potentially a different method of torture altogether, but the big opportunity in that scene is that Bond is vulnerable. Bond has been tortured. He should be disoriented and hazy. That could have been a great moment for Madeline to step up and save Bond and help get Bond to a place of stability. That really should have been a moment of partnership between the two of them. It would have been great if, for example, Lucia had turned out to be a double agent for Spectre. She shows up at the Spectre meeting, but showing that she betrayed Bond and led him there on purpose and becomes essentially like the Irma Bunt of the story. And you could have had Madeline kill this Irma Bunt-esque version of Lucia as they're escaping, the torture scene there. And then Bond has recovered enough to kind of work with her as they shoot their way out of Blofeld's lair. Something like that would have given that relationship a little bit more momentum, a little bit more clarity for Bond as to why Madeline might be this good match for him. Because I think the stuff before that, the stuff that happens on the train and everything like that, feels pretty lightweight. They have a really great scene in Tangier, but they're still so frosty at that point that it just feels like they go from frosty to in love in 24 hours without a real dramatic pivot. So if you have that relationship continue to be a little bit tense, and then she saves Bond's life, and together they can work together to protect each other and find a safe space with one another, it kind of builds into this narrative a little bit that the reason they're attracted to each other is that they start to find a sense of purpose and safety in one another. And those are some broad thematic ways that I think the story of Spectre could have started to be clarified in ways that just give unity to the movie. I know this is kind of a rambling video, but I think about this stuff all the time, and so I kind of need to dump this into video format or it's never going to leave my head. If you've been watching this long, thanks for bearing with me, and I'm interested in your thoughts on my ideas and proposals here. They're obviously not the only ways to fix Spectre, but they're kind of what I would give as a kind of script consultant had I been brought in right before Spectre started shooting. So, thanks for watching. I look forward to catching up with you all in the comments, and I'll catch you in the next one.